Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and book by book. We are in Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to continue on and get right into it. I did an extended introduction to the book, and then we're just going to move on, and like I said, I'm going to take my time through the first 11 chapters because there's a lot to unpack, as you will see. Okay, so let's get into it. Verse 1, again, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now, in the beginning, God. Let me just kind of stop there because that's what this book is. Right off the bat, we're introduced to God. And one of the interesting things about this here, as Moses is revealing, that God here claims to be the creator. But not only the creator. See, so let's do a little contrasting here. And again, I'm not going to get too deep into this subject, although it is certainly worth the getting into. When we talk about God and the concept of God, of course, it's not unique. It is common. And so now we kind of come to the question of the truth, right, about God. Who is telling the truth? Now let me just say this, and I said it earlier in a few studies before. The Bible is not a scientific book. The Bible is not per se a historic book, even though yes, it is history. In other words, there are some things about history you can point to. It is history, especially from the standpoint that when we talk about Jesus, the life of Jesus, 99% of what we know about Jesus comes from the Bible. It's sole source. Okay, in other words, in terms of the history of it, the historical action. So you cannot, in any way, try to develop a narrative about Jesus without the Bible, although some try. Okay, but the Bible is a revelation of God. God's revelation of himself. God's narrative. God's revelation of his plan and his purpose. That's what the Bible is about. Now, as we get into this, here we're going to get the accounting of creation, the account of creation. So right off, God says, I created the heavens and the earth. So obviously now that's going to come in contrast with other philosophies. We will see, once we get to chapter 3, why we have those other philosophies. We will see why there's paganism. Okay, so the idea of, and remember, Moses is writing this in the height of paganism, right? He's writing this after God has delivered the children of Israel from Egypt. They're used to pagan. They're still dealing with pagan. Israel, up until the Babylonian invasion, their chief sin was idolatry. That's their chief sin. They never shook it. You remember they made a golden calf, and we'll get to that later. But anyway, but God is giving us now His revelation of Himself. In the beginning, God. So the concept of God in and of itself, of course, other than God's revelation, the Bible, are perversions of the reality and the truth. Now something else happened just in the 18th century. We said that in the 18th century there was a birth of what we know as humanism. The seeds of humanism kind of started sprouting up. Now, kind of interesting because there were several things that happened that developed during the 18th century. For example, you had the Jehovah's Witness, Mormonism, Christian Science. Now, and although these were all religious, what was interesting is what they share with evolution, and I'll get to that in a moment, was they were expressly anti-biblical. In other words, here was the established historical faith. And by the way, even though at the time the historical Christian faith was corrupt, it was corrupted by the Catholic Church. It was corrupted by even at the time. Now, by this time, even Protestantism, many of the denominations were corrupt. Well, that gave way to these even more corrupt and perverse, imaginations of men. So in other words, those three that I listed, and there were a few more, but that was kind of the prominent one, and they're still around today. You have some 7 million Jehovah's Witnesses. I forget, probably around the same number of Mormons. But they all started because a man in his heart rebelled against God, the revelation of God. And in both cases, in all three cases, whether it's Christian Science, whether it's Mormonism, and then ironically, you always see the kind of the inclination of man to revert to some kind of false religion, false representation of God. That's what these men did. They just made up stuff. Let's made it up. Okay. Another thing, however, that developed was evolution. And that exploded because the science grabbed hold of evolution. And so Charles Darwin developed the theory of evolution. Now, it was much simpler back then. It is more complex now. And so the idea that creation came from natural processes and not divine. This is what Darwin started. What you have to understand, with Darwinism, and you have to understand the who and the motive. So science now, that the theory of evolution has now taken hold of science. Now understand that the scientific argument is this. This is why they get away with it. If you ask the question of whether or not the Bible should be taught in schools, right? I'm going to say absolutely. If you ask the question in the American, in terms of separation of church and state, first of all, there is no such thing as the separation of church and state. Christians have gotten really on the wrong battlefield with that. Their fight for culture, their fight for a Christian America, they're going to lose. And this is why you have that. You see this changeover, this turnover. Why did we change? If you had X amount of years in American history, where the dominant thought was Christianity, but now we don't want that. It's not the dominant thought no longer, right? It's still the major religion, but it's not the, and that's a big question mark in terms of what it is you think of the religion, but people are rebelling against that. And one of the mechanisms is through what they call science. So what you have to understand in terms of a science now is the so-called science, right? Because what's behind that is the motive is to say, let's kind of erase God. Now see, understand, remember, he says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? God created the heavens and the earth. All right. There's no conflict in terms of the creation and science. But now you have to get into motive. And you can't always argue that scientifically. You can't always argue that philosophically, right? Motive. But we have to consider the motive. When science latches on to evolution, there is a motive behind that. And that is, let's get rid of God. Let's edge God out of the picture. If evolution is true, there is no God. Now, what the fools don't realize is what are the implications of that, right? In other words, if there's no God, then how do you determine right and wrong? Now, there are people that will say, atheists, especially atheists in science, and you can say people of thought, they would argue, you're being silly, you're being foolish. That's not true, because remember, everything that they know about right and wrong comes within the context of how Christianity shaped what is good and what is wrong. In other words, man in his own self, go back historically, man will never arrive at good. All right, I'll get more to that when we get to the fall of man in terms of sin. But you have to understand that that's the motive. This is why evolution is so appealing, because if the creation started from natural processes, then yeah, throw away your Bible. But throw away everything for that matter, right? As I said, the logical conclusion would be eat, drink, and be merry. Who's to say who's right, who's wrong? But, so now you come back to this thing what's called science or evolution. So evolution says, again, natural processes. So you kind of have to think that through, and now you got to say, well, okay, if the creation starts from science, if the creation starts from science or natural processes, how did it start? So then you develop timelines, right? You develop what they may call the Big Bang theory, that at some point, bam, right, explosion happened. But that's foolish. It is. It's so foolish. The idea of evolution as it is taught from the origin, see. Now, of course, there's what's called macro and micro evolution. So when people say, well, there's evolution, look at evolution. Like, for example, I'm evolving in the wrong direction in the sense that I'm getting older, right? But you think about, you start from conception, you see an evolution. See, that would be a more accurate term of this evolution, right? The sperm and the egg, embryo, the fetus, right, grows. There's a child growing. That is an evolutionary process. In and of itself, you could say that, okay, we have no problem with that. Now watch this though. So you see a 9-month evolutionary process, and then birth happens, right? And then from birth, life begins to happen. The evolutionary process continues to maturity, and then as you get to a maturity, adult stage, you kind of hum along, and then all of a sudden you start to, as I said, and look at me, start to kind of go down. And since you, in reality, you're kind of starting a long dying process, your decay. Okay. Now, if you want to call that evolution, fine. But watch this. You wouldn't say that the evolution just started by itself. That conception started by itself. There was the beginning. Something started it. When science then says, okay, because again, there are people with motives, and again, ungodly motives, to be able to say, if we can say this science is true, these theories, I want to remind you that evolution is still a theory. If we can say that these theories are true, right? If they're true, then how would we, if they're true, right? If evolution is true, then we got to come up with some timelines, because if God didn't create it, so then you say 14 billion years, that should give us enough time. 14 billion years should give us enough time to have all this form. Right? Because remember, we're going to etch God out. We're going to start with an explosion. Now, first and foremost, there are a lot of gaps in evolution as it is taught. A lot of gaps. I'm talking about the creation. First and foremost, what started the explosion? Now, of course, every atheist that I've spoken to, because every now and then I'll get a dialogue, and then they will brush me off as being ignorant and stupid. But they never answer these questions, because, in other words, if, as an atheist will say, if you say there is no God, if you for sure there is no God, and they will come up with all kinds of scientific and philosophical reasons why it's not, how can you say that? But if you say in terms of evolution that God did not create it, what started the explosion? The elements themselves, you either are saying, one, the elements themselves always existed and are eternal, which you don't have any proof of. By the way, they don't say that. They basically simply say, we don't know. That's it. We just don't know. Right? We don't know. That's what they say. We don't know. But I'm going to continue this, guys, in the next study, because I'm out of time here. I'm going to continue this in the next study. And again, I'm going to explore this. Again, it says evolution versus God. I'm going to continue this because as we're sitting here, let me just say this. The Bible is not a scientific book either. It's a book of faith. All right, guys. See you in the next study. All right, bye-bye.